Have you ever wondered who truly writes history? History has never been told by the defeated. The victors define who is the hero, who is the traitor, who is the saint, and who is cursed. And when we mention the greatest traitor in Western tradition, no one else comes to mind but Judas Iscariot, the man recorded as betraying Jesus for 30 pieces of silver. But what if I told you there's another story about Judas? A story buried, suppressed, erased from sight for nearly 2,000 years. An ancient manuscript so dangerous that early church fathers fiercely denounced it, for it dares to overturn everything we thought we knew about Judas. That manuscript bears the name, the Gospel of Judas. Before we delve into Judas's hidden story, let's take a step back. Let's glance at other traitors in history. Brutus, the man who stabbed Julius Caesar, someone once considered his closest friend. For centuries, Brutus has been branded a backstabber, the epitome of betrayal. But did you know that to many Romans of the time, Brutus was a hero, one who dared to resist the tyranny of a man becoming a dictator, destroying the Republic? Or Joan of Arc, the maiden who led France through its darkest hour. She was condemned for heresy, burned at the stake, only to be canonized as a saint centuries later. And if you're a fan of pop culture, surely you've seen characters like Loki, Anakin Skywalker, those painted as villains only to reveal the deeper you look that the lines between good and evil are rarely clear-cut. Could Judas be the same? For almost 2 millennia, theologians only knew of the Gospel of Judas through a few bitter lines from Irenaeus, an early church father writing in 180 CE. He mocked a sect of Christians daring to spread a false gospel, portraying Judas not as the betrayer, but as the one who understood truths no one else could grasp. What kind of manuscript could warrant such outrage? They claimed that in it, Judas and Jesus have a private, secret conversation, unlike anything you've seen in the canonical Gospels. In this gospel, Judas isn't motivated by greed or silver. Instead, he alone perceives the divine truth of who Jesus really is, while the other disciples remain blind. Yet for nearly 2,000 years, that manuscript vanished, hunted, burned, labeled heresy. Until the 1970s, in a remote cave in Egypt, fate took a sharp turn. A treasure hunter stumbled upon a limestone box filled with ancient scrolls, including a codex containing the Gospel of Judas. But the journey of this fragile document was far from over. What followed was a tale filled with smuggling, greed, near destruction, and an almost miraculous recovery. The story of the Gospel of Judas isn't just gripping because of its explosive content. No, the manuscript itself lived a life of intrigue worthy of any thriller, filled with smuggling, greed, neglect, and, against all odds, redemption. Let's rewind to the 1970s, to the arid region of Minya, Egypt, about 120 kilometers south of Cairo. Picture this, a nameless treasure hunter wandering through a cave in search of forgotten relics. In a country where mummies, statues, and ancient tombs are as common as grains of sand, stories of treasure hunters aren't rare. But this time, the prize wasn't gold or jewels. It was a simple, heavy limestone box. Inside, wrapped tightly, were several fragile papyrus texts written in ancient Coptic, among them the Codex Chakos, containing none other than the Gospel of Judas. Little did the treasure hunter know, he was holding something that could shake the foundations of Western theology. Soon the codex found its way to an antiquities dealer in Cairo, a shrewd operator named Hannah. Hannah knew what he had in his hands, and like any good businessman, he set the price sky high, $3 million. An outrageous sum at the time, especially for a fragile, half-decayed manuscript whose content could spark the fury of the religious establishment. For years, Hannah scoured Europe and the United States, searching for a buyer bold or reckless enough to pay. But no one bid, and so, frustrated, Hannah made a bold move. In the mid-1980s, Hannah smuggled the Codex into the United States, evading customs and legal hurdles. He hoped that in the land of collectors and fortune seekers, he'd finally close the deal. But fate had other plans. No buyer emerged, and shockingly, Hannah simply locked the manuscript away in a safety deposit box in Long Island, New York. For 16 long years, the Gospel of Judas languished in that vault, far from the dry sands of Egypt, exposed instead to the humid, unforgiving climate of New York, a death sentence for fragile papyrus. Without proper preservation, the codex began to decay, the ink faded, the pages crumbled bit by bit. It wasn't until the year 2000 that the codex changed hands again. A Swiss antiquities dealer, Frieda Nussberger Chakos, bought the manuscript. But by then, the damage was severe. At least 10 to 15% of the text was lost forever. Realizing the true significance of the codex, Frieda no longer dared treat it like a mere commodity. She entrusted it to professional conservators and partnered with scholars to piece together the fragmented papyrus, painstakingly restoring what remained. And then destiny intervened once more. After decades in darkness, the world finally caught a glimpse of Judas's hidden gospel. In April 2006, National Geographic published a complete translation alongside high-resolution photographs of the manuscript's fragile pages. Shockwaves rippled through the theological world. For the first time, scholars and the public alike could read the intimate, controversial dialogue between Jesus and Judas. A narrative long buried now stood in stark contrast to the version upheld by the church for millennia. Why did the early church go to such lengths to denounce and erase this gospel? Why does it portray the 12 apostles as blind, misguided men, while Judas, long vilified, alone understands the divine truth? And most importantly, was Judas truly the villain, or was he a man sacrificed by history, labeled a traitor to maintain order? So after nearly 2,000 years of suppression, what truly lies within these fragile, faded pages? What was so dangerous in this manuscript that the early church felt compelled to denounce and bury it? The answer lies at the heart of the text, a worldview that completely flips the foundation of mainstream Christianity. A story where the man history remembers as the traitor turns out to be the only one who understood the ultimate truth. The Gospel of Judas opens not with a familiar image of loyal disciples gathered around their teacher, but with something much more unsettling. Jesus stumbles upon his 12 disciples praying together, possibly practicing the Eucharist, one of the most sacred Christian rituals. But instead of joining them or blessing their act, Jesus laughs. Yes, he laughs right in their faces. Startled and confused, the disciples ask, "Teacher, why do you laugh? We are praying to God." And here comes the first shocking twist. Jesus replies, "You don't know whose God you are worshiping." According to the Gospel of Judas, the 12 apostles are not just spiritually ignorant, they are worshiping the wrong deity. They think they are honoring the Almighty. But Jesus reveals they're actually offering prayers to a lesser, inferior God, the creator of the material world, whom the Gnostics call Saklas or Yaldabaoth. In simpler terms, Jesus is telling them that the world, as they know it, isn't the divine masterpiece they believe. Instead, it's a flawed creation ruled by an ignorant, even malevolent being. The Gospel of Judas belongs to a stream of thought known as Gnosticism, particularly the Sethian Gnostic tradition. In this cosmology, the universe wasn't created by the one supreme benevolent God. Instead, a chain of emanations, spiritual beings descending from a hidden unknowable God, gave rise to the cosmos. Somewhere along the way, one of these beings, blind and arrogant, became Sakla/Yaldabaoth, the demiurge, who fashioned the material world and trapped human souls within it. To the Gnostics, this world is a spiritual prison, and in the text only Judas, not the other apostles, recognizes this horrifying truth. At the manuscript's core lies the private dialogue between Judas and Jesus. Judas approaches Jesus saying, "I know who you are and where you have come from. You are from the immortal realm of Barbelo." In Gnostic belief, Barbelo represents the first emanation of the supreme unknowable God, a being of pure light and divinity. In other words, Judas is the only one who understands that Jesus didn't come from the material world, but from the highest spiritual realm. The other apostles, lost in ritual and tradition, mistake Jesus as a servant of the demiurge, while Judas alone sees the truth. Here's where the Gospel of Judas delivers its most daring revelation. Jesus asks Judas to hand him over. The so-called betrayal is not an act of greed or treachery. It's a necessary step to liberate Jesus' divine essence from the confines of his physical body. Jesus tells Judas, "You will sacrifice the man that clothes me." In Gnostic terms, the material body is just a temporary vessel, a cage. By surrendering Jesus to the authorities, Judas helps him escape the demiurge's world and return to the divine fullness beyond. This gospel forces us to ask, who truly betrayed whom? Were the apostles blind, clinging to the flawed creation while Judas understood the cosmic game? Is Judas the villain, or the man who accepted being despised by history to fulfill a higher mission? The Gospel of Judas doesn't hand you an easy answer, but it compels you to rethink everything you thought you knew. Judas Iscariot, the name etched into history as the epitome of betrayal. But if we brush aside the layers of dogma, of well-worn narratives, what remains? Perhaps we'll see a figure far more tragic, far more complex than any simple villain. The Gospel of Judas doesn't paint him as a greedy traitor selling out his teacher for silver coins. No. It reveals a Judas who is clear-eyed, aware of cosmic truths no one else dares to see. He knows Jesus hails from realms far beyond the flawed material world. He understands that the soul of Jesus needs release, not salvation through tradition, but liberation from the prison of flesh crafted by the demiurge. And because he knows, Judas accepts the role no one else can bear. But what does enlightenment cost? For Judas, it costs everything. He is branded a traitor, despised across millennia, condemned in every sermon, every retelling. What could be more bitter than knowing the truth, yet being cast as the ultimate villain by history? Let's step back. Throughout time, every system of power, every organized society has needed a scapegoat, someone to blame, someone to cast out, to define what is good by showing what is evil. In early Christianity, that figure was Judas. Without Judas, the narrative lacks tension. There's no betrayal, no crucifixion, no resurrection arc to anchor the faith. Judas becomes the necessary darkness so the others may shine. Consider this. What if Judas had refused? What if he hadn't handed Jesus over? There would be no trial, no sacrifice, no redemption story. The entire theological structure collapses. In the Gospel of Judas, he knows this. He plays the role of the traitor, not out of malice, but as part of a cosmic plan. He accepts infamy, so the narrative can continue. He bears the burden so others may believe. At this point, Judas transcends the idea of mere betrayal. He becomes a symbol of profound loneliness. The one who understands, acts, and endures the hatred of the world, all to fulfill something greater. And perhaps he doesn't need to be compared to Prometheus, Brutus, or Loki. Judas stands alone. His story is enough to echo through 2,000 years, forcing us to ask, who gets to decide who is villain and who is hero? Why was the Gospel of Judas buried? Because power needs a clear, digestible story. 12 faithful disciples, one evil traitor, a divine plan sealed in black and white. A gospel that dares to portray Judas as enlightened, the apostles as misguided. It threatens the foundation. It muddies the waters. And so the story of Judas was written not by truth, but by the winners of history. If there's one takeaway from Judas, it is this. Would you dare do what's right if you knew the world would forever call you wrong? Would you have the courage to question the stories handed to you, even if it means standing alone? Judas is cursed by history, but in that curse lies the starkest lesson about truth, power, and the cost of seeing beyond the surface. Have you ever wondered why, for over 2,000 years, the name Judas Iscariot has been etched in infamy as the ultimate traitor? Why, even after the rediscovery of the Gospel of Judas, Despite evidence painting a different picture, society still clings to the narrative of Judas the betrayer. The answer lies beyond Judas himself. It lies deep within the machinery of power, a system so old yet so effective that it continues to operate seamlessly to this day. Society always needs a traitor to maintain order. Look at any civilization, any period of history. Every structure of power, whether religious, political, or social, understands a simple rule. In order to keep faith intact, to define good and evil clearly, someone must play the villain. In early Christianity, Judas fulfilled that role. His betrayal became a pillar, a contrast to the loyalty of the other apostles. It was neat, digestible, a perfect story of sin and salvation. In modern society, the mechanism hasn't changed. When political turmoil arises, there's always a traitor to the nation to point fingers at. And when economic collapse strikes, there's always a scapegoat labeled the cause. When someone dares to question the system, they're quickly painted as disloyal, dangerous. The pattern repeats endlessly. The crucial question is, who decides who the traitor is? Certainly not Judas himself. He never held the pen. His story was written by the victors, by church fathers, theologians, and leaders who needed a villain to stabilize their faith, to anchor their version of truth. Alternative gospels, dissenting voices like the Gospel of Judas, were condemned, burned, forgotten. What remained was a simplified tale. Loyal disciples, one evil betrayer, order restored. You've heard the phrase, history is written by the victors. The story of Judas exemplifies this perfectly. Any narrative that aligns with the dominant power is preserved, copied, taught. Any narrative that questions, complicates, or destabilizes that power gets erased. The Gospel of Judas didn't disappear by accident. It was systematically buried because it dared suggest Judas wasn't a villain, but perhaps the only one who truly understood the divine mission. Power doesn't want nuance, it wants simplicity, us versus them, loyalty versus betrayal, good versus evil. You might think Judas's case belongs to ancient history, but glance around modern society. A public scandal, someone's labeled a traitor to the people. An economic crisis, a group is singled out, blamed for all ills. A whistleblower steps forward, branded as disloyal, dangerous, destabilizing. The formula hasn't changed. The system always needs a Judas, not for the sake of truth, but to preserve the illusion of order, of righteousness, of control. What makes Judas' story so haunting isn't just the injustice he suffered, it's the uncomfortable question it poses to us. How often do we unknowingly buy into the version of betrayal crafted by others? How often do we accept the narrative of the traitor without pausing to ask, who benefits from this story? Who holds the pen? Judas in the gospel saw beyond the surface. He understood that truth was far more complicated, that playing the role of villain might serve a greater purpose. And perhaps that's the lesson that lingers. Whenever we're told who the betrayer is, we should ask ourselves, who is telling the story and why? Throughout this journey, we've unearthed the hidden layers of the Gospel of Judas. We've followed the manuscript's perilous path, delved into its shocking cosmology, stood face to face with a Judas far different from the villain history painted. But after all, the most important question isn't, was Judas truly a traitor? The real question is, are we today unknowingly repeating Judas's story in our own lives? We live in an age flooded with information, opinions, and pre-built belief systems. How many times have you unquestioningly accepted that someone is a traitor simply because the majority says so? How often do we nod along with mainstream narratives, never pausing to ask, who is writing this story? For what purpose? Judas became the scapegoat not because of his actions, but because society needed one, needed simplicity, needed order. And that cycle continues every day. Perhaps the most frightening thing isn't betrayal, it's complacency. It's living within stories crafted by others, never daring to ask uncomfortable questions. Judas in the Gospel of Judas faces the most painful truth, that the world isn't as neat and righteous as people believe, that sometimes the path to liberation requires actions that others will never understand, and he accepts the cost: infamy, hatred, eternal misjudgment. So I leave you with this. If you saw a complicated, inconvenient truth, would you have the courage to stand by it, even knowing the world might forever brand you a traitor? Would you question the stories you've been told, even if it means walking alone? Because Judas's tale is not merely about the past. It's about the power of narrative, about how easily history can distort, and about whether we have the strength to write our own truth, even when it comes at a price. He is a mirror, reflecting back at us every time society tells us who to blame, who to fear, who to reject. The question is, will you look deeper, or will you let someone else write your story for you?